For many, the key issue that had to be faced was not the confection of the whole constitutions, but the establishment of a principle of collegiality. As I say, especially in the United States, in Spain, and to some extent in South America. Partly in reaction to the exercise of authority by recent abbots general, there was a certain desire to restate strongly the primacy of the general chapter in the governance of the order. This was done by appropriating the idea of collegiality used by Vatican II with reference to the episcopate. So it was perhaps loosely done, but it became a kind of phrase which served as a rallying point for those who wanted a less monarchical idea of the office of Abbot General, and you might say more collegial idea of the general chapter. The push came from the United States, thence it travelled to South America and Spain. Many of the French abbots were unsympathetic to the idea, and some, like André Louf, opposed it strongly, using his very considerable intellectual gifts to argue against it. Mainly by pointing out the weaknesses in the proposition. There was no positive content in his contribution, but just showing the weaknesses of the arguments. The use of the expression in the constitutions changed little in practice and is rarely used nowadays. Have you heard recently anybody talking about collegiality? Yeah, there was a great battle to get it included in the constitutions, but it's had almost no positive use since that time. People talk about collegiality a little bit. The word we use, or Pope Francis tends to use, is synodality, a far more expansive concept, which would certainly have been opposed by most of the abbots at Holyoke. André Louf has pointed out that there is some ambiguity in the term. Sometimes it's used in a strict legal sense, sometimes more broadly. But the point about the chapter is that it wasn't forcing through a text. It didn't get Project 3 and then push, shooting down any who opposed it, but it was open to contributions from all sorts of different people. And here are some that I happen to remember. André Louf, the phrase, "in the sober anticipation of the coming of Christ," talking about vigils. It's a lot of people had particularly good phrases which were incorporated in it. Dom Jerome of Zundert, "Simplex cum Deis simplici commercium." The monk is a simple man who seeks a simple relationship with God. Not quite as fluid as his Latin suggestion. Dom Kevin, my own abbot, made the point, or asked for it, that one of the duties of the abbot was to pray for his monks. And this has actually been stressed also by Pope Francis in his encyclical on fraternity, where he says one of the functions of fraternity is intercession. And And Kevin made the point that often there's very little you can do for people, not only because of the limitations of the abbot, but also because of the seriousness of people's problems and so forth. But the one thing that he must do is to pray for them. Dom Michael of Snowmass had the insistence on including the structures of oppression, that the monks try to keep themselves away from this in their financial dealings and so forth. And in the light of some of the recent revelations about the Vatican, I don't know how much it applies to monasteries, but when you deal with finance, you have to be pretty careful. Dom Amandus of Tegelen was emphatic and something of an expert on the whole question of the Trappist trademark. He could talk for hours on the subject. It was, however, largely a matter of European monasteries that had a number of industries that bore this Trappist trademark, and they were seeking to find a way of giving it some legal standing which would be valid in all the different countries of Europe. Dom Bernardo of Azul, Bernardo Oliveira, who became Abbot General, had the phrase introduced, the maternal care of the Mother of God. Dom Lois of Cito was responsible for the whole of Constitution 86. So whether you like it or not, it adds a nice cheery note to the whole text. But this is just to say that, yes, individual people contributed a lot to the constitutions. These are just noting some particular examples. But it was not the matter of imposing a text, but it really was recreated from, in every single constitution, was subject to recreation. That's about all that I'm going to say about Holyoke as a whole, because what happened at Holyoke was just the start of a process. It was just the beginning. When I came out of one of the meetings, I was hijacked by Mother Benedicta, who was the promoter of the nuns chapter that was to be held the following year. And she asked me at that stage if I would also consider writing a text for the nuns chapter on the basis of the Holyoke text. So that what was considered as at El Escorial was fundamentally the monks' constitutions, but in a feminine form. And of course we thought we could do that with a computer, which was fairly successful. We replaced sisters with brothers, brothers with sisters, abbot with abbess. But in one occasion we ended up with an abbess general. But generally it was simply the text of Holyoke feminized in a certain way, to be delivered to the chapter, who would then make further adaptations. So 1985, the chapter of the nuns also travelled abroad. They went to Spain at the huge monastery at El Escorial. The abbesses discussed, modified and accepted the Holyoke text in their general chapter held at El Escorial in April and May 1985. Many improvements and clarifications were introduced at this point, which were later incorporated in the monks' texts. So it was a single ongoing process of adaptation. Dom Bernardo Oliveira enunciated the principle: if the Holyoke text is open, it is in order to be able to take a step forward. So to experiment, to find new ways of doing things. If the law leaves things open, the law leaves the door open, we'll go through the door and see what happens. During this chapter, the base of consensus was broadened, and particularly relative to the link between the two branches. It was fairly obvious that both branches of the order desired a degree of unity that would only come about later. But just another point about the danger of computers. In the French text that was distributed, because they were using Spanish computers, the Saint-Siège, the Holy See, became Saint-Singe, with the tilde over the top of the holy monkey. So certain things were not able to be done except with the approval of the holy monkey. There are a few little things like that occasioned by the incompatibility of computer programs. The other thing about El Escorial was the proportion of European superiors was much greater than at Holyoke. And that meant that it was probably a more conservative chapter, a less adventurous chapter, and that the steps that were taken by Holyoke would never have been taken if Escorial was the first of the chapters. A disproportionate amount of time was allocated to the discussion of enclosure and the tactics necessary to gain approval for a form of enclosure for nuns that was Cistercian rather than Carmelite. That was a particular problem that had to be faced up to and insisted upon, which meant making a few concessions in the text to placate the potential objections of the Holy See. So this is the picture of the assembly. You might recognize some faces or not. And this was the Escorial Constitution Commission. Mother Gail, Dom Armand Veilleux, Mother Danielle, Sister Jose, and myself. And this is us at work, or pretending to work. Perhaps all the papers on the table illustrate the fact that there was a lot of confusion and a lot of mess involved. It wasn't just the matter of doing something that was pretty straightforward. Gail is holding a text of the Holyoke Constitutions, and you can see another one in front of me. But there were various folders and statements and documents and so forth that all had to be taken into consideration. I think it's very important to realize just how much consultation and adaptation goes into the production of a final text, how every word is scrutinized and often has meaning which the rapid reader will certainly miss. And this is Dom Armand, myself, and Mother Gail. And this is the dinner to celebrate the end of the chapter. And the empty bottles bespeak the happy smiles on the faces of the three. Dom Jacques Brière, I think he was there as the Abbot General Secretary of that stage. He became later the Abbot of Trefontane. Myself and Mother Virginia of El Sereno, who was, I think, the vice promotrix of the chapter. There was a series of cartoons done by Dom René of Bricbet, René Bonpin. He had nothing better to do during the chapter than draw. So there you see a picture of the presidential table, which has Mother Benedicta and then Dom Andros, Mother Virginia, and myself sitting up there. In front of a very, very elaborate tableau. The Abbot General about to vote with Mother Virginia beside him. Different drawings of the Abbot General in all his different manners during the chapter. This was Dom Bernard Johnson, a cartoon of the youth of the order, so-called, Mother Gail and myself. And that was the general chapter at Holyoke. And now we pass on to the third stage of the process, which was the general chapter that was held in Rome in 1987. Actually, it was officially called a mixed general meeting because there were two general chapters side by side, as it were, voting separately. The final stage of discussion was scheduled for 1987, when a meeting of superiors of both branches would discuss a final text and prepare the way for the chapters, plural, to confirm what had already been enacted. You know, one of the requirements of the jurisprudence of the order is that whatever is enacted by one chapter has to be confirmed by the next chapter. And so the way the order was giving itself a bit of time is saying, yes, we've passed constitutions, but they have to be confirmed. And you could go on forever with that, of course. This introduced a new round of consultations and amendments, both at local and regional levels. The effort was made to incorporate these into the existing text with some collateral damage to the unity of style and consistency of thought. So, whereas the Holyoke text and the Escorial text had a certain unity of style, all sorts of other things came to be added to it that just didn't seem to fit in somehow. And often these were the result of concentrating on an individual number rather than on the flow of the constitutions as a whole, or trying to envisage a total picture of the order. The transmogrified text was presented to the Mixed General Meeting in Rome during December 1987, and a final version was hammered out. As events transpired, the repeated wish of earlier chapters that the new text be prefaced by the rule of St. Benedict and other basic texts was quietly left aside as impracticable. Just put aside, if you please. And this is something that was circulating during the chapter. Monks and nuns both trying to get their own thing to eat, or it could be different things. They're straining against each other and getting nowhere. And then they sit down and think about it, and then if they both go and eat of one, and then they can eat of the other. It was a kind of invitation to consensus, to try and accept compromises, to accept negotiation, but otherwise we'll always be pulling against each other and end up in stalemate, unable to move forward. Whereas if we give way to the other, well, there is the possibility that we might produce something useful that will eventually allow us to move on. And this is a picture of me at that chapter, 1987, with Dom Christian of Atlas. Which one do you think is the saint? Well, only one has been beatified. I think he's only beatified, hasn't he? Yeah. But I remember that conversation quite well as it happened. He was talking about the need to infuse a spirit of joy into the constitutions. And I was trying to explain to him that, important as the spirit of joy may be, the constitutions were something else. This photograph was taken by Dom Donald of Nunrall, who eventually sent it to me. But just to raise a few sundry things to finish, to look at a great mystery. If you look at the text of the constitutions, in Statute 24A, it reads, "There is no recreation in communities of the order." This repeats a sentence that was in the 1925 text. It was proposed at Holyoke, and COCO, the Constitutional Commission, allowed it to go to the vote because they said it's so awful, it will never get through. In tone and language, it was in discord with the way the constitutions were developing. It was rejected, but by a single vote. And the way the votes were counted at Holyoke was that they were counted one by one, and you had two numbers, yes and no, and they both flipped over. So it took about 5 minutes to get to the result, and you could see them two running neck and neck and wondering which would get through. In this case, it was just rejected. The French bloc and one United States abbot, who will remain nameless and who is different from the other one, asked for a new ballot. And André Louf was very much in favour of this. He said it was clear that some didn't understand the significance of the text, blah, 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 blah. But he was checkmated, as it were, by somebody, by pointing out that the procedure which he had written forbids a second vote at the same chapter. So he wasn't able to get the second vote, and that was rejected by the chapter. He did, however, manage to get a clarification inserted in the minutes of the chapter to say that this is not just the rejection of this option doesn't mean that recreation is thereby introduced, which is a whole lot of face-saving nonsense. Huh? The item was not voted on in 1985 by the nuns or in 1987, but mysteriously reappeared in the final text, hidden at the end of the Statute on Silence. So where did it come from? It didn't come from any chapter. It had actually been rejected by a chapter. And how was it introduced? And it wasn't introduced by the Vatican. I have my suspicions as to who slipped it in. Because of its dubious parentage, the exact meaning of recreation has not been fixed. One of its eloquent proponents, I remember at the chapter when this was a moot issue, I went up to my room. We used to work late at night in the Constitutional Committee, and I went up to my room to get another document. And I had to go through one of the lounges, and there was one of the great proponents against recreation, sitting in an armchair with a glass of cognac in one hand and a cigar in the other, and watching television. So I said to myself, watching television, sitting in an armchair, smoking a cigar and drinking cognac is not recreation, because he wouldn't be recommending the banning of recreation if any of these things were. But it shows, I think, the kind of weirdness about some of these propositions, where certain abbots wanted to impose obligations on the monks from which they considered themselves exempt. There is no recreation in communities of the order. And yet I know that several of those who were in favour of this had done the grand tour on the way to the chapter, going through Mexico and up through the United States before arriving and pulling their habits out of their bag. So there's lots of stories attached to individual issues, and this particular one is one that we could say, who was it that put it in? Well, you'll have to use your own detective skills to arrive at that conclusion. So let's just revise things for a moment of where things, the redactional history of our constitutions. It began with Project 3 in December 83, Latin translation in 84, the raw Holyoke constitutions in May 84, the revised Holyoke text, which meant it was translated into Latin and a few things were straightened out, and I did that in Rome with the help of Father Riccardo, who was a professor of Latin, had been a professor of Latin. And then the Escorial constitutions, and then the revised Escorial text in June 85, the Rome constitutions in 1987, the text submitted to Rome in 1988, the first response of Congregation for Religious and Secular Institutes, as it was then called, in March 89, the reworked 1987 constitutions in January 1980, and the constitutions were approved on the 3rd of June 1990. And subsequent changes by general chapters have been approved. So it's a long, even taking Project 3 as a beginning and not going back to the whole history, it's been quite a long process. And perhaps that helps us to understand that there may be hidden treasures in the text which don't immediately appear to the inadvertent reader. But we'll look at this in the next section.
When I call, answer me.